Welcome to the Double Helix History Podcast. Today we're going to talk about Australia. We spent 3 months in Australia this summer, and we talked with lots of family historians, we talked with lots of scholars, we talked with lots of people generally, and it was a fascinating time to be in that country. It was fascinating to talk to people about this stuff and to find out quite how different they thought they were and quite how different they are from scholarship and family history elsewhere, but also the kind of similarities and the things that we could see that we could pull out. We were very warmly welcomed in Australia, and in fact we'd like to pay tribute to the organisations that helped us when we were there. They were so supportive and so generous. This is particularly the Heraldry and Genealogy Society of Canberra, the Genealogical Society of Victoria in Melbourne, and the Society of Australian Genealogists who are based in Sydney. And without their help, we wouldn't have been able to do our research. And they were incredibly lovely. Really opened up so many great things for us. They were so generous with their time and their expertise, and we'd really like to thank them very much. But broadly, being in Australia was very welcoming. We got very much a kind of sense of openness. People were very happy to talk about things, very comfortable talking about stuff, wasn't it? I mean, it was a lot of fun, that, wasn't it? We really enjoyed it.
You were on the telly?
I was on the telly, I was on TV, yeah. I was on a programme about the revelation that might tend on genetic genealogy and DNA investigation. In fact, that's what we're going to talk about today. Today's podcast is more nitty-gritty and seedy than last time. We're going to talk about family drama, we're going to talk about kinship, we're going to talk about ethics, we're going to talk about a duty that we might have to our families of keeping information or making sure they're well informed about what might be the consequence of DNA testing be. We did sort of various events in Australia, some focus groups, some discussions, we did some symposia, we did some public events, we did some academic events. It was pretty full on time. But largely I think what we found was that most people who do family history in Australia are comfortable with the fact that someone in their background is a bigamist. Is that not? I mean, pretty much that's what we found. I haven't used the word bigamy more than twice in my life, I think. And then in Australia, suddenly it was every 2 minutes. So why do you think that was?
Well, I think a couple of people mentioned it, that Australia being sort of founded on large numbers of people either being sent away or running away from other places. They often had things to run away from.
Well, yeah, and I wonder whether there's this kind of sort of acceptance of that. People are very comfortable with that, and almost kind of wearing it as a kind of badge of honour. This kind of like crazy understanding of your past, where obviously it's all a bit chaotic and not quite legal. Do you think so? Or?
Yeah, I think perhaps there's a generational thing in that. Maybe 50 odd years ago or longer, people may have been a bit ashamed about the shadier characters and, I don't know, convicts or bigamists or anything like that. Whereas maybe perhaps part of Australia as a nation maturing into itself and people becoming more relaxed and open about their history, it's actually something now that's celebrated.
Well, certainly that's what people seem to say, wasn't it? That it was a generational shift and that previous generations have been concerned about about legitimacy and about kind of ignoring those black sheep, whereas people seem to be very keen on their black sheep and very happy about that. And it really made me think about two things. One is what we're going to talk about today, which is about the ethics of this. So when you find this stuff out, is it okay to then share it with your family? But also, about how distance means that it's kind of okay. If you met someone who was a bigamist now, you'd be maybe not quite as pleased as you might be. But actually, in 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it's kind of all right.
It's almost as if you knew the person, or if maybe someone who's still alive knew the person closely, it's painful. If it's 2 or 3 generations back, it's just interesting.
But it's also still part of you somehow, right? So because it's like your relation. So I think it's very strange. And also there's a continuum as well, right? Because there are certain crimes that are okay and certain crimes that aren't okay, right? And I think that particularly in Australia's history, there's been quite a lot of participation in all kinds of policy and action that people wouldn't necessarily be as comfortable with. But what struck me talking to our family historians in Australia was that they did seem to be happy with that kind of dark history as well. They were facing up to a certain type of way of thinking about their nation's past. I thought that was quite astonishing, actually.
Mm-hmm. The way you can sort of contextualise it in, well, you know, it was a thing that happened at the time. It was based on the social mores of the time, and you know, we're not necessarily proud of it, but we can only sort of understand it.
And I guess that because the social history aspect of family history, that's going to always come up, isn't it? You're always going to be thinking about the individual and their relationship to wider social movement or social context, and so you can both be empathic and also judgmental at the same time, because you can kind of say, well, I can see where this has come from, but that's not us, you know. And there's a relativism there, which I think is quite refreshing, actually.
And definitely a recognition that, you know, the way in which society and culture has changed, things that might have something like illegitimacy that might have been, you know, a terrible thing to have to tell people about, is actually no one would really bat an eyelid about now. So
Absolutely.
you can see people in a different light.
Although what's interesting is that the genetics can force these conversations in a way that people weren't necessarily as comfortable with, in as much as we met lots of people, didn't we, who sort of said, well, it's fine when it's on paper, it's fine when I kind of make an assertion about something because I've done some detective work. But discovering something through your DNA test, it's quite blunt, isn't it? There were quite a few people who looked like they needed a bit more time to deal with the revelation that had come that they weren't necessarily expecting.
I guess particularly if it's something where you're looking for a particular archive, you might often have a bit of a hunch that there's something not quite right here already, or else you wouldn't be doing what you were doing. But yeah, the DNA as being scientific, being objective, just brings things up without any sort of preparation necessarily.
And I was just thinking the other thing is that a lot of people came in the early days to Australia with fairly shady backgrounds with the convicts, so therefore stories about families weren't shared as much down the generations, because there was sometimes a lot of shame with the convicts.
Yes, they came here to make a new start, and here we are digging it all up again.
That's exactly,
and exposing
it's
it.
not just convicts, but there were lots of other reasons that people came out to start again, leave behind what they didn't want.
I had the opposite experience in my family, in that I grew up with loads and loads of stories of people who were born in the 1780s and stuff, you know, like people I've never met and my grandmother had never met. So I'm wondering whether it's a difference about the kind of families or the kinds of secrets, or
there's definitely a kind of embracing of it. You were talking about convicts and shadiness. Everyone I've spoken to here pretty much has been very comfortable with their family being migrants, and their families often having criminals.
Well, convicts are called Australian royalty
now.
I sent to my girlfriend last night. I've used the word bigamy more in the last 2 months than I have ever used it.
We're very comfortable with it now.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I can tell you that when I was doing my husband's family, his grandmother, so we're going back, you know, quite a few years, she would take me back as far as she knew, and I knew she knew more. So it didn't take me long to work out there was a convict there. But she wasn't ever going to talk about it or admit to it.
And England's the only place I've met people who are ashamed to have illegitimate ancestors. I've met English people,
totally.
but not in Australia. Like all of us, I would think, have got illegitimate ancestors at some point.
Yeah, that sort of thing is really interesting. It's that feeling of connection and belonging. Yeah, really.
And I think that's far more in the colonial countries, if you like, rather than the home countries where the people have, where we're sort of looking to try to connect to something that goes back more than 200 years.
And it's also, you've got multiple sources, because most people in Australia have got, you know, they're not just from southern England or from Ukraine or from Scotland or Germany. They've got a good sort of 57 mixture, you know, the Heinz 57 varieties sort of statement, you know, and it's trying to understand very much wider connections than, okay, I had family from Kent or I had family from Dublin or from wherever. It's not just one place. It's trying to understand how all these different roots go back into a multi sort of areas, and I think you appreciate it differently than somebody who's sort of history is more centred in one place because they're not a migrant population. But because
I mean, my
Australia's a
Lancashire
migrant,
family that lived in Preston, you know, as far as they went for holidays was Blackpool. You know, so they only went down the road, sort of thing, with the exception of the one time they came out to Australia and decided it was too hot and went home again. But I just think that that's a very different, attitude to.
So our three contributors today are very, very interesting scholars. They come from very different perspectives, very different intellectual and disciplinary backgrounds. Tanya Evans is an expert in family history and social history from Macquarie University in Sydney. She spoke at the State Library of New South Wales about issues to do with family history and research.
And what I have increasingly been interested in is focusing upon the ways in which family history is producing the kind of knowledge around empathy and education and active citizenship. So I've been looking at people's emotional responses to their family history research and what impact it has had on them as individuals and how it disrupts their understanding of the family but also the nation in the process of undertaking their research. But I'm also really interested in how it's producing active citizens. And this is a kind of form of citizenship that is focused upon participatory democracy and engagement with local and community organisations, as well as other forms of political engagement as well. So I want to chart the ways in which family historians are committed to teamwork and to voluntary work on lots of different levels, on a familial, local, community, national and international level. And you know, this kind of parallels quite a lot of the research that other scholars are undertaking in other national contexts. I'm thinking here of Henriette Road-Cunliffe, who's working in Copenhagen, on the ways in which family historians are kind of contributing to participatory heritage and working with archives and libraries in order to produce history together. And here I am, again, in the State Library. I spend a lot of my time here in the State Library of New South Wales, pictured next door with Maria Linders, who is a member of COASIT, an Italian-Australian family historical organisation, and else. And here I want to look at the ways in which, you know, different individuals can communicate their knowledge about the past and what impact that then has on them with their local and community groups. And here we're back with Carol Turner. You know, she loves making contact with genealogists. She's a member, like I'm sure lots of you are, of several different Facebook groups. She has a blog. Do many of you have blogs here, family historians? Yeah, there I can see a few hands there. You know, so you're engaging with others around family history digitally. You're often making contact with kind of seventh cousins removed who live in Texas. You know, you're sometimes visiting their houses and producing this kind of genealogical tourism that is completely fascinating. You know, Carol's also kind of going out doing lots of transcribing for people who need their help, you know, taking photos of graves and then sharing that information online. And I think that kind of collaboration requires further analysis. And that's partly because I think it has a huge impact not just on individuals as researchers, but also upon communities more broadly. And for Carol, you know, she talks about how family history has transformed her as an individual. She calls herself a quiet feminist, strongly believes in racial equality, and, you know, like Emma has shown, has discovered the ways in which, you know, looking at the desperate lives of people in the past, how that makes her rethink the lives of kind of people who are poor in the present. And small acts of kindness have become her oeuvre. And this is really important because this sort of a kind of emotional engagement with the past, this kind of transformative impact of historical learning and research is having an enormous impact on public memory making. And this is linked to some of Jerome's work on historical enfranchisement and Anna Clark's work. Jerome met Anna Clark yesterday at UTS at a masterclass he was doing on public history. Again, about how you know, the ways in which ordinary people are engaging with historical practice and, you know, and historical subjectivity in that process. And I think family history is important because it is allowing individuals to become much more active and engaged citizens across the globe. And I think that's important in today's age. You know, yesterday Jerome was talking about public history and Trump and Brexit. And actually, it's really important that we look in the positive ways in which kind of this broader project of history making and production can reshape our understandings of the community and what that might mean for all of our futures.
Next up, we're going to hear from Ashley Barnwell, who works at the University of Melbourne. She's a sociologist, and she'll be talking with Jerome about real-life revelations, secrets, truth, and ethics, and the way in which this impacts on families and family stories. And this interview comes straight from the University of Melbourne's premier Irish bar.
Well, I actually got into it in social theory, from coming from a theoretical perspective. So I was really interested in collective authorship. Like, so how is it that we tell stories, but they affect all of us? So it's like I tell my own life narrative, but it's completely implicated in other people's lives, and what's the ethics of that? So I was really interested beyond that a bit in truth telling.
Yeah.
You know, and evidence of those kinds of things. And I was working and writing, like my PhD was in social theory and the history of theories of emotion. And I thought, I need to get a job. I've got to be able to apply this to something or think through it in a way that I can communicate this and those kinds of things. So I became really interested in the family of that site for collective storytelling and the ethics and politics around that. Like even just thinking about my own brother, like that we would look at a family photograph and I'd be like, oh yeah, I remember that. This is when this and this happened. To be looking at me like, oh, that's not. You know, so there's all of this stuff around memory and shared stories.
And have you come across, it's interesting you say it because when we've spoken with family historians, there's often been a kind of concern about truth telling or the consequences of finding, quotes, truth. For instance, this morning we were talking with someone who uncovered a whole can of worms when she did some DNA work. How do you find people deal with that kind of responsibility?
I think in all different ways, and I think that's why it's quite interesting, because you have this, because obviously I'm a social scientist, so I'm interested in the kind of thing between the macro and the micro, and I think you see it in there, like people's sensitivity towards past generations. Like in one sense they might be completely abhorred by the kinds of social stigmas that made past generations keep something a secret, but they still feel like they don't want to upset grandma. So they're not going to reveal it, you know. So there's this complex thing of a political sense that we shouldn't keep these things secret anymore, but yet I'm going to keep reproducing this because of family sensitivity. So I think there's that idea of whether we should tell the truth or not. Like even in what we think is a very confessional culture, like a tell-all culture, people are still preserving all kinds of things for different reasons.
But practically, how do you find people actually actively suppressing things? Or not telling at all?
Look, I think they are, but I think the more interesting thing is why and how. Like, how is it that we navigate telling or not telling things, and why? Like, what are the reasons? What are the social reasons and personal reasons, and where are the connections between those?
And I guess, is it the case, you think, that every single individual instance is particular, and so, you know, everyone's negotiating, navigating their own set of ethics within their own family group and their own...
I think definitely that, and people feel like they're very particular, but I think, coming from a sociological perspective, like you see the shared or objective aspects of it as well. It's like families keep the same secrets often because we have these normative ideas of what a family should be or what a life course should be, like when you should get married and when you should fall pregnant and who you should be married to and all those kinds of things. Like that is something within a certain kind of bounded time and space shared society that people will share, even though secrets are so personal and the impacts are so personal. What we've chosen to keep secret is often a very shared, generational, cultural kind of thing.
Well, and also presumably secret keeping is not anything to do with keeping secrets that have nothing to do with you personally on you precisely is because you're addressing a sense of shame or a sense of anxiety which is not necessarily yours. Like you're saying, like a kind of cross-generational secret keeping where you may feel that obviously it's fine that, you know, grandma's sister was actually her mother or whatever, but that you're somehow projecting a kind of reading of that, which means that you don't want to reveal it because you feel that it might impact upon them.
It's certainly when I've been sort of speaking with other groups, there's been a range of opinion about this, and oftentimes people have found information they were uncomfortable with having, and there's a kind of ethics in it that kicks in, which I don't I guess my question is not about that particular Arabic, but whether that's the same as finding something out in a census data. Do you think it is, or is it more live somehow? That it's genetic. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's causing a lot of problems in America. Like they're looking at the Facebook pages and things like this with the genetics one.
But I think all it's done is just reveal what
the truth.
The truth,
yes, that's
which
right.
for many generations has been able to be kept hidden because access and things like that was so much easier to just kind of. We've all got one of those stories in the family where there's an illegitimate child, or something happened, or there's a convict in the family that people didn't want to admit to. Everybody's got one, but once upon a time it was very easy to just forget it and just talk it out of the family story. But now the family story comes up in all these other places like DNA, so all you're doing is revealing stuff, but it still brings up the same sensitivities about just keeping something to yourself.
And do we have the right to reveal our ancestors' secrets?
Yes.
Just because they're dead?
But do you think there's a generational thing that's
Yes,
sort of
I definitely think it's
generational.
Yeah, my grandmother, for example, was illegitimate, but none of her grandchildren knew about it, or even her children knew about it. I was the first one that uncovered it, and it was all. But why do we know? We don't know. Our generation doesn't care. And I've got a distant cousin who had found that her grandfather was in jail early in life, and she didn't know, because her generation and her parents' generation just didn't talk about those things because they were shameful, she said.
And the other one I've found is suicide. That was never spoken about. And when you uncover, 3 or 4 generations back, no one living today in the family know anything about it.
That's interesting.
Maybe that distance you're talking about means that people could move away a lot easier, or had to move further away and therefore could lose contact easier if they were trying to move around.
So easier for Australian ancestors to kind of keep secrets.
Yeah, to just go to another state, but that's like thousands of kilometres away.
Yeah. Everyone seems to go to Tasmania, that's what I find. Everyone's going to Tasmania.
No, but sort of the sea coast was much more accessible, where there were lots of ships, in the early days, so around the coast people could move fairly readily, even though the roaring 40s would have been, would have got seasick in those, but that's that southern ocean, the southern oceans, and that's how Australia was first discovered, by Europeans, was being blown across.
Blown over it.
I think we also end up with different couple combinations, because in England you tended to marry somebody who lived near you, whereas one side of the family, I've got someone from Scotland married someone from Yorkshire in Tasmania, and you get more of a mix-up, especially with the immigration since the Second World War, although that would be the same as England actually, because you've had the same. But before that, we probably got more diverse couples than in a lot of port cities in England. You got a lot of mixed.
Our final contributor to this section is Indira Chaudhary, who teaches in Bangalore. Indira is a world-famous expert on oral history particularly, and here she is speaking at the State Library in New South Wales about ideas of orality and memory.
This is a family album of my aunt, my father's sister, which I found it a while ago, and I was struck by this page looking at it recently. At the center, she has her grandparents who did not leave what became East Pakistan. But look what she has around, and that is interesting because she has Tagore, she has Sharachandra Chattopadhyay, they are 2 writers. Subhash Bose, who was fighting for India's independence, Nehru, who became the first Prime Minister of India, Chittaranjan Das, again a political figure, a spiritual figure, Ramakrishna Paramhamsa. What you cannot see, and she's placed them all around, is landscape. Places that, were special to where she came from. She's not identified them, but these family albums and in stories where they talk about the rivers and the water bodies that they grew up with, and of course the cost of fish and the kind of fish. It's only now that I begin to understand that when I was doing my PhD in London and I spoke to my father about one particular fish I had bought in the Bangladeshi store, he was thrilled to tears. He said, "I'm so glad you had that. That's a fish I grew up with. We don't get it in India." And I said, "My goodness, I can't understand why he's so, so emotional about this." And I understand now, because it was really something that was part of their lives. And, you never got that once they had moved to India. So they had moved into an industrial town, that's my grandfather, and you notice that, these were also photographs in my aunt's album. This landscape was the landscape of work. It was the landscape where, they earned a living. It was not a landscape that had stories. So it was very interesting that, while she kept these photographs, there would not really be, this was something you can see, that's a colliery, coal mine area, and he was a doctor in the steel city. So, these are not seen as having stories. They have stories now for me. But they did something else, and that is, in the houses they built, they seemed to recreate parts of their lives in that village. So look at the cow and the calf, the banana tree, planting herbs that were needed for certain rituals, planting a jackfruit tree because a certain ritual needed 63 leaves of the jackfruit tree. I mean, I'm always amazed that they actually sat and did this to remember and to memorialize the landscapes that they had left behind. So this was the way in which they recreated that. So I think I'm still, this is very much work in progress, and I'm trying to still think of, what these landscapes mean. But I'm struck by the ways in which, there were these attempts in this industrial town to recreate some kind of a rural life.
We've heard Ashley and Indira talking about memory and family history and oral testimony, thinking about DNA as a historical source then. How is that troubling those kind of traditional ways of passing on history or memory?
Well, I think one of the values of thinking about different types of memory is that it demonstrates to us that DNA is just another one of the ways in which we remember, and those are never necessarily innate. Different cultures do different things. There's no kind of normative way of remembering or normative way of collecting information, which always reminds us that we need to look at why we do certain things, what our decisions are about certain things. And my interest in DNA at the minute is how it's becoming normative and how it's becoming normalised without a recognition of that argument. We need to be kind of self-aware about what we're doing with it before it kind of accretes into a practice that we haven't really thought about too much. But it does change memory, I think. I think it definitely shifts the way we might think about the past. In two ways. One, it very, very clearly can have the power to change what you might think about your own past. You may have thought that your parents were X, and this may change that, rightly or wrongly. It may introduce new aspects of your past in terms of your background, your family, your kinship group. So there's that. The other thing that it does materially is allow us to make assertions about the past, which changes the way we think about it, I think. It allows us to say stuff about things that happened in the past, and it allows us to change, therefore, our view of that past. And I think so, therefore, it's clearly going to affect memory. I always use this example. So I had my DNA done for genealogical purposes, but my nieces, who are 2 and 6, will know themselves genetically, and it will be second nature to them. They'll have had their genetics looked at closely. They'll have personalised medicine. they will be comfortable about seeing themselves from the point of view of their genome in a way that I'm not. Not even comfortable. It will just be that'll be how it is. So their memory will change. They will think in a different way than I do. Their concept of memory will be different as a consequence. Their concept of themselves will be different as a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it clearly changes the way we conceive of our relation to the past and the way and the things we remember and stuff.
Information.
Both these kind of comments are about that sort of duty, or no, the ethics of having knowledge about the past and what that means to people's lives in the present. Is it different necessarily that if you were to find out this through a genetic match rather than if you were to find something out through paperwork? Is there a category difference for? Do you see what I mean?
I think it comes
I don't know
back
whether there is.
to the thing before that paperwork can lie, whereas in a sense DNA can't.
Right.
So you could always say, well, mistake or documentation.
I've been thinking about this DNA and identity thing, and I've come up with this idea that basically identity is our cultural identity and DNA is our biological identity, and they are on different dimensions. And the fact that you now know that you're not biologically related to your parents growing up doesn't mean that you don't think of them as your parents. So they intersect, but they're very, very different things.
But being able to hold that in your head is quite a sophisticated thing. I think it is very definitely the case, but it's quite a sophisticated division to be able to make between biological identity and cultural, acculturated identity.
I think there's rightness in people lying sometimes about how circumstances. A woman who's raped just says the child's my husband's. All sorts of examples where it's actually good for a lie to be.
They did it for the right reasons at the time.
Yeah,
a lot of that's being exposed. I read an article the other week by one of the American genealogists, and she was basically saying how she worked through this whole family constellation and she's saying, well, the father was either the woman's brother or her father, and this is how I worked through it, and this is what you look for, and it'll look like this if it was the father, and it'll look like this if it was the brother, and obviously they're finding enough cases of things like that that they're now sort of.
Yes, I'm not saying secrets are good for sure, but they've served purpose culturally for a long time.
The other group nowadays is children conceived of sperm donation.
I find that very difficult.
Yeah, my husband's got a girl who's a match, and she sort of said, "Oh well, I met my sperm donor father, and he's got 2 kids, and I met them, but I know there's another 6 or 8 of us out there, and I don't know their names, but I just know the gender and date of birth. So before I date anybody, I have to say what's your date of birth,
Is that a privacy issue in Australia particularly? Because that's
it was at the time people donated. At the time you did your donation, you were guaranteed never to be outed, but that's all changed. And a lot of it came from the child wanting to know.
And from Jigsaw, from adoptees.
Adoptees.
So this brings me on to one of my questions, I guess, which is, what have you discovered, found out things, tested things that you weren't really expecting when you are as a consequence of the DNA stuff?
Are you recording?
And again, I appreciate this gets into the slightly complicated areas.
You mean with ethnic origins or matches?
Anything really.
I'm guessing for many of us it's helped us break through a number of brick walls. So, and particularly if you've got any sort of adoptions in the family,
or illegitimate.
People
are losing relatives, they're gaining relatives.
So I've been through DNA, been able to trace who her father was, and she has living first cousins who we're going to meet overseas. So I think, and I can see how DNA is going to help me, providing I can find the right people to test, help me with some other brick walls. So I think that's one of the things that understanding each of the tests and how they can work for you is going to allow us to break through some of those brick walls.
But it's a long, hard slog.
It is.
Sometimes.
But it seems to me there are Facebook groups where there are lots of adoptees.
Or like DNA detectives.
Yeah, maybe it's just that one that I look at. You're constantly
it's worth
seeing
reading
people.
those sorts of ones though, because they have some good tips about what everybody should be doing, whether you're looking at adoptions or not.
I was going to say that they're also have got really good stories, like pleasant ones, and they've got some real horror stories too. So it can open up good and bad things.
one of the major areas that has been where DNA sequencing had really important impact is around adoption. People who've been adopted, looking for family members who they've never been able to trace through the paper methods. And an interesting aspect of that is that there are people who, particularly on Facebook groups and other sort of communities online, who actually volunteer their skills that they've built up around DNA and around family history to actually help total strangers from other side of the world to try and connect with their family members. Which on the one hand is just an amazing sort of voluntary way of collaborating and helping other members of the community, but there's also some people are very gung-ho with that practice, and don't know if
it's difficult across different countries and different cultures, right? Because different places have different laws. There's different bits of information you can get from different places. So, on the one hand, you can see why, if this is instigated by an adoptee or an orphan, then that's an astonishing thing to be able to offer them. But at the same time, families are families. Human beings are human beings, and if we've learned one thing in this year, it's been that there's always going to be some kind of secret somewhere. It's the house thing about everybody lies, and sometimes people want their lies to stay lies. They want things to stay unknown. They want to have repressed that, or to have kept that dark, or kept that a secret. And DNA is an interesting one for this, because it has the kind of power of revelation and truth. It's like the sword of justice, it's kind of like very much like, this is the kind of silver bullet, this is the absolute thing. And it gains a kind of moral authority as a consequence. We can do this, so we should do this. We can find this out, so we should. And I'm not necessarily sure it always should be. But then the ethics of that are down to everyone who's involved in it. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I mean, I think if you're a sperm donor, or if you're someone who gave up a child for adoption for various reasons, you may not wish this to be coming back to you for a very, very good reason. If you're in a painful situation, or a difficult, or dangerous situation, this is not necessarily a good thing to be able to find this stuff out. Equally, if you're an adoptee, or if you never knew your parents, or if you're an orphan, obviously, I'm not going to say they shouldn't be allowed to do this. But you have to take quite a lot of care. But this is where why it's fascinating for me about history, because history is not neutral, and the way you think about the past is not neutral. And the idea that we could be complacent about the past is exploded by this instantly, because you have to recognise family and individual emotion, and how upsetting this stuff is, and how people's engagement with the past is invariably emotional and coloured by affective issues.
So, some really interesting moral, ethical implications that we've covered today. Real ties to family stories with family history, and how genetics is impacting on that. What can we expect next time, Jerome?
Well, next week we're going to talk a lot more about ethics in a much more wider sense. We're going to think about data and ownership. We're going to think about storage and archiving. And in particular, we're going to talk about legacy. What happens to this information after people have died, have passed on? What happens to all this stuff? Where does it go? And what kind of ownership do we have over this material?